Hi Lars, thanks for being with us today. You're going to talk to us about your new novel, Nietzsche and the Burbs. Let me begin by asking you, what motivated you to write this novel?
Thanks, Patrick. Yeah, my novel is an account of a contemporary version of Nietzsche, who is a new boy in the sixth form in the prosperous suburbs of the southeast of England. Now, Nietzsche is a nickname his fellow pupils give him, and he becomes the lead singer of a rock band who are looking for a new collective way of life in the midst of the boring and passionless suburbs. And the reason why I thought this might be an interesting novel to write is because, reflecting on my own background, my own upbringing in the suburbs of London, I thought, what's the very opposite of the suburbs? What's the opposite of the blandness, of the boredom of the suburbs? And for me, it was a philosophy of Nietzsche, which is so life-affirming, so passionate, so exciting, and reaches so high in its goals.
It's not actual Nietzsche, but it's a very similar approximation of Nietzsche. I mean, in the novel, he's comes from a sort of aristocratic or sort of lower aristocratic background. He's troubles with mental health. He has a very, I shall say, chaste relationship with a lady called Lou, which is all very, very similar. So I was wondering why that character of Nietzsche, or this reincarnation of Nietzsche, what's his function in the book, right? How is he an avatar for the main characters? And the main characters are, of course, sort of a bunch of sort of teenagers who are about to sort of in a between stage between school and sort of finishing school and going off to uni and things like that.
That's right. Okay, so my Nietzsche, this Nietzsche who is reincarnated into the contemporary suburbs of London, is a mouthpiece for a particular kind of nihilism, which he claims, it's one of the things he says in the novel, which reveals itself only now. So for my character Nietzsche, we're living through a moment of what he calls the fulfillment of nihilism, which is a kind of concretization of the death of God. So this is what we're living through now, according to Nietzsche, in the suburbs. We're living through this ordeal of nihilism. Nihilism presents itself today as such in the form of our experience. Now, for my Nietzsche, what's characteristic of our experience is it is characterized as despair. And despair, according to the Nietzsche of my novel, has become the most common experience, the most widespread. And for this reason, it's no longer possible to ignore the questions raised by the death of God, the questions raised by the collapse of a general sense of meaning and purpose to existence. So the challenge for the Nietzsche of my novel is how we might become worthy of the ordeal of nihilism, how we might become worthy of the death of God.
Could you elaborate a little bit on that word nihilism, just because it's a slightly technical term, I suppose, that not everybody who's listening might be familiar with?
Yes, of course. So nihilism is generally understood as a falling away of a sense of meaning and purpose. That's the usual understanding of this word. The things which formerly appear to be valuable, intrinsically so, now appear to be meaningless, unimportant. And so nihilism we often link to a kind of teenage despair, a teenage sense of things not mattering, things not being important. Now, in Nietzsche's work, we have a more subtle version more subtle account of nihilism. In Nietzsche's work, nihilism is not simply about the meaninglessness of life. It's not simply about that. It's about our reaction to what we discover as meaninglessness. It's our reaction to the universe without purpose, without intrinsic meaning. And what Nietzsche argues, and this is the historical Nietzsche I'm talking about here, what Nietzsche argues is that the importance is to discover life is meaningless and then to try and make meaning in some sense, try and produce meaning, try to live out a life which is meaningful in some way. And the point is, for Nietzsche, the historical Nietzsche, we have to struggle to live, and living is a struggle. We have to struggle for meaning.
So this goes on in the historical Nietzsche, as you put it. We have this distinction between what he calls passive and active nihilism, and passive nihilism is the, I suppose, negative response to the death of God, where we sort of look inwards, we become despairing, we do not understand our direction, our purpose, and that leads to all types of self-destructive consequences for ourselves and others. Now, for Nietzsche, active nihilism is, as you say, the response to that. How do we take on that ordeal and accentuate the positive, I suppose? How do we turn it into something productive? Is in the novel then, is that's the arc of the characters? That's the plot, I guess. They are in this state of passive nihilism, and they're trying to move towards something meaningful and something productive.
That's exactly it. I suppose we should talk a little bit about the idea of the death of God.
Yes.
Just to set a context here. So we can understand the death of God as a falling away of the possibility of reasonable belief in God. No longer does belief in God seem to be a reasonable thing. So the death of God occurs when we have the rise of science, when we have the rise of secularization in society. The death of God occurs at that moment. And what happens, according to Nietzsche, is we no longer have meaning. And as you say, this might lead us to a kind of passive nihilism. And in passive nihilism, what do? Well, we simply lie back exhausted. We let the present destroy the possibility of a future. In active nihilism, by contrast, the idea is to destroy the present to create a future, to destroy the ideals of the present in order to create new ideals. And that's exactly what the characters, in their individual ways, these teens, these sixth formers, try to do. They're trying to live the life which would create meaning, which would struggle for a fully fledged form of human existence.
So they're in this situation, the character. So, sorry, the names escape me again. Who have you got? You've got Nietzsche, you've got Chandra, you've got Paula, you got Art, and these are all teenagers, I guess. So and I'm not saying this in a bad way, because the novel is quite funny. Nietzsche and the Burbs is quite a funny novel. It's kind of sort of reminding me if the in-betweeners had been reading sort of Beckett, Kafka, and Nietzsche.
Sure. These are, it's a comic novel. It's supposed to be funny, supposed to be entertaining. And these are teenage characters who are teenagers of the present. So as you say, the in-betweeners who've read Beckett, the in-betweeners who've read Adorno, that's the kind of characters I'm presenting here. I think that captures it beautifully.
So, thanks. So when you were writing this, Lars, who did you imagine was your audience, I'm wondering? I mean, is it a book for everybody and nobody?
I think it's a book for people who feel something similar to many of us, who are overwhelmed by a sense of nihilism. So it's a book for people who feel a general sense of a lack of meaning, a lack of purpose, who find it difficult to engage in the world and are wondering why and what's going on and where that comes from. So it's a book written for people who are living through this period of the fulfillment of nihilism in some sense, who are living this ordeal of nihilism. And I hope that these people, when they read it, will be entertained, they'll laugh, they'll be amused, they'll find some kind of solace in the fact that someone else feels as they do. And that's one of the reasons I turn to comedy. If I want to put something on TV, I look in comedy for something which makes me feel I'm not alone in what I feel. So the idea then is the book reaches out to people who feel a lack of meaning, of purpose, of engagement. That's the idea for me.
Yeah, and the mood of the novel, I think, is very, well, maybe you can speak to this. The mood of the novel is self-consciously apocalyptic. Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, it's certainly apocalyptic. So the novel is it concerns the climatic catastrophe, financial catastrophe, all the characters in various ways, not just the the sixth formers, not just the school pupils, but also their teachers, all of them are overwhelmed by a sense of apocalypse. Now, apocalypse, we can use this term in the biblical sense, which means something being revealed, something being shown. It's normally God's plan that's being shown. But the apocalypse in the time of the death of God doesn't reveal anything. It reveals the absence of a plan, the absence of meaning, the absence of purpose. So that's what the characters all feel. They're overwhelmed by a sense of impending doom, of financial catastrophe and climatic collapse.
Which is kind of true in a way, because we are actually living those in times.
Indeed, this is exactly our reality. This is the world in which we inhabit. We inhabit a world in which, you know, things seem to be moving towards a close, towards the end, and it seems that as individuals, there's very little we can do about it. There's a lack of political will to change the world. Now, we see in people like Greta Thunberg a righteous anger, a righteous indignation at the state of things. But the question is, how does this connect up with any political movement?
Right, and that's an interesting example. The people who criticise Thunberg seem to be, well, people of our vintage, Lars, probably people, middle-aged men who don't get to sail across the Atlantic in a boat. But she's I mean, the critique she's getting is germane to your novel, I guess. You know, she's a teenager. She's someone who's trying to make the world a better place. You know, you might sort of debate her tactically, whatever, but the vitriol and the ire that she's receiving very much is of that sort of nihilistic despair. It's like, it's cynical, you know, there's no point doing this. What is she at? You know, you can't save the entire planet. Everything must remain small. Do you think there's something to that?
Yes, absolutely right. I mean, Greta Thunberg is someone with ideals, with aspirations. You know, she wants to change the world, and this will seem to the cynics contemptible in and of itself. And that is, for me, a denial of what's implicit to youth. Youth, for me, is about hope. It's about possibility. It's about change. And although my characters are certainly made miserable by the state of the world in which they live, they are also active. They're trying to do something. They're trying to harness their apocalyptic energy for some meaning creation, some task of overcoming the people they are.
And what do they do in the novel? I mean, there's a couple of things they do. I mean, they do what all teenagers do. I mean, they take drugs. They form a band. Nietzsche and the Burbs, as the band is called, which is the eponymous name of the band and the name of your book. They hang out together. They have relationships. So I'm thinking, like, how for you does that sort of resistance to the apocalyptic tone manifest in the novel?
Well, yeah, so the main thing, I suppose, in the novel is the formation of the band. And that's my version of the real historical Nietzsche's aesthetic theodicy, his attempt to provide a non-theistic escape from nihilism through the redemption of suffering, through the creation of tragic works of art. So for historical Nietzsche, one way to make meaning is to trying to escape from nihilism through an acknowledgement of suffering, a facing of suffering, and a redemption of suffering. The idea for the real Nietzsche is that we can somehow affirm suffering, that suffering is not something we should flee from, that in fact suffering is something that we need to embrace if we're going to become greatly creative. So my characters form a band in order to be greatly creative in this way. What they're struggling against is what Nietzsche in Thus Spoke Zarathustra calls the culture of the last men, of the last human beings, who know nothing of love or creation or longing, who want the same, are the same, they're mediocre. So that's what these characters are struggling against through the creation of this band. But the characters have other means of trying to escape nihilism. One character, Paula, places her faith in romantic love. Another character called Merv in a sort of Dostoevskian spirituality and in disco. Another character places her faith in lifestyle, in sunshine, food and swimming, and this means for her moving to France. Another character places his hopes in some kind of wild, sacrificial suicide. So the characters are always trying to overcome nihilism, to overcome themselves in some way. And at the end of the novel, it's up for the reader will find out whether they do actually escape.
Your diagnosis in a novel is of our modern Western capitalistic age. And I suppose if someone was going to sort of critique you, say, with all of those things that you listed as alternatives, they're all just kind of lifestyle choices. Those things are as empty as the despair that they're actually feeling, which they're all very, very self-conscious of. But do you think there's something to that, or do you think there's that your characters have found something deeper, more meaningful?
Well, that's the idea, yeah. So the characters are trying to overcome their situation, to overcome the nihilism of the suburbs actively, and this involves acknowledging their suffering, embracing their suffering, facing up to the suffering that's implicit to human existence. One of the ways they do this actually is to recall moments of bullying in school. Not only the bullying that has affected them, but the bullying that's affected other people. So they've seen around them suffering and misery, and they want to try and escape this, not by denying its existence, but by transfiguring its meaning. The way in which they try and do this is actually, again, modelled on the real Nietzsche, on the historical Nietzsche. What they're trying to do is in some way affirm their existence, to affirm everything that they've suffered, that other people around them have suffered, to affirm it in the name of a great yes saying, a yay saying to existence. Let me set a context for this. What the real Nietzsche argues, what the real Nietzsche claims in his work, is that life is implicitly about suffering. Over the millennia, this has led to Christianity, to Buddhism, to philosophy and art, the attempt to evade this suffering. These cultural formations are an attempt to overcome suffering in some way. The point for Nietzsche is we need to face suffering and face existence as suffering. And once we contemplate this, once we contemplate the horror of existence, we mustn't give in to nausea and to despair. Now, one of the things Nietzsche argues is that what frustrates us is that we cannot change the past. We can't alter the past. We can alter the future, but we can't alter the past. And what the characters accept in Nietzsche and the Burbs is exactly this impasse, this sense in which the past, everything that's happened, can't be given meaning. But what they do instead, what they struggle for, is to try and affirm everything that's ever happened, everything that's ever occurred to them and other people, all the horrors, all the suffering. What they want to do is to affirm and say yes to all these things happening, to affirm and say yes to everything wretched that's happened. And once they've done that, the idea is, and this, they resemble the real Nietzsche here, once they've done that, they've overcome nihilism. They've overcome any attempt they might make to evade suffering. They've embraced suffering. They've affirmed suffering as important. They're looking towards the discipline of suffering, of great suffering, as being implicitly important to their creativity. And in so doing, they've left behind nihilism.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that the historical Nietzsche, famously talked about, he was two concepts, I guess. There's his notion of amor fati, which is the love of fate, which the characters reference in the novel. And there is also, I suppose, his critique of Christianity. Now, in his critique of Christianity, as I understand it, what he does is he criticizes Christianity because it turns suffering into a virtue, or it sort of fetishizes suffering, if you follow me. And it's, the idea that you can redeem yourselves through suffering, but instead he proposes this alternative, this notion of amor fati. So in what sense did for you is the novel a representation or a sort of a cipher for this notion of amor fati?
It's a way of saying yes to the world around them. It's a way of affirming it exactly as it's happened and exactly as it's happening. It's acknowledging they can't make much of a dent in politically. They can't change society, but what they can do is change their attitude towards the world around them. So in that sense, they have a love of fate, a love of what's happened, a love of the suffering that has brought them to where it is they are.
Yeah, it's quite a sort of a modest goal in a way, isn't it, Lars? I mean, the characters, they, I guess, and this is sort of this sort of explains Nietzsche's sort of antipathy towards, or the historical Nietzsche's antipathy towards, sort of grand schemes of sort of political transformation. All those grand schemes that he sort of prophesized would, sort of morph into the worst forms of nihilism in political ideologies of the 20th century. But in a sense, Nietzsche is a lot more modest than that. All he's sort of proposing in his philosophy is that you could sort of change your attitude, and then you could sort of change the world around you.
That's right. I mean, it might seem modest, but on the other hand, what Nietzsche is inviting us to do is to affirm the dreadful events that have occurred and occur all around us. Now, there is actually a critique of Nietzsche implicit in the work, and some of the characters speak about this. And the critique of Nietzsche is that this overcoming of dreadful events, of horrors all around us, this is something which is actually impossible to do. Now, Nietzsche famously has a great suspicion of the emotion of pity. So for Nietzsche, pity is something which is inherently suspicious.
Compassion is a Christian virtue, yeah.
Exactly. These things are inherently problematic because they lead us to sympathize with poor people around us, with people who are suffering. And that distracts us from the task of becoming great in some way. And this is the side of Nietzsche which can be very hard to swallow for contemporary readers, is that Nietzsche had a great suspicion of equality, of the idea that human beings are equal, and of democracy. So Nietzsche wants to leave these ideas of the egalitarian, of democracy behind. He rejects politics as a path to follow, which is going to lead to greatness. By contrast, what Nietzsche places faith in is this ability to love fate, to overcome suffering, or the effect of suffering, to overcome nihilism by embracing the situation you're in.
What if Nietzsche is right, Lars? I wonder. I understand what you're saying. I mean, that Nietzsche is very unpalatable to lots of people for a variety of reasons. But one of the reasons that people don't get on with Nietzsche is because he's very critical of human rights. He's very critical of egalitarianism and equality, as you say. But all of those are kind of sort of structures of belief. I think he's probably critical of the idea that you can find salvation in external forms. Is that right? That's what happens with the death of God. With the death of God, we have this sort of gaping void at the core of our being. We've got no meaning. We've got no purpose. So what do? We sort of we come up with these replacement ideologies, be that politics in sort of fascism, socialism, democracy, or be that in whatever, in sexuality, or we are in sort of food or alcohol, whatever. All of these things which we fetishize, I suppose, or overemphasize to sort of to fill that gap, to fill that void. And that, for Nietzsche at least, a very sort of destructive, self-destructive even consequences. For Nietzsche, is it the question that we have to save ourselves from salvation, be that in religion or politics or whatever?
Yeah, in some sense, that has a plausibility when looking at Nietzsche's work. What Nietzsche is suspicious of is anything which will give us false succor, false consolation. What Nietzsche admires is looking at suffering, looking at the horror of the world, and bearing it. So in that sense, for him, these political, social solutions are entirely palliative. These are just an attempt to try and ignore suffering, to ignore horror. And he writes wonderfully in Daybreak about this objective of obliterating all the sharp edges of life, of changing human beings into sand, into small, soft, round, unending sand. And that's where he thinks what the people he calls heralds of sympathetic affections are going to lead us. We're going to become mediocre particles of sand who are smooth and simply lie there. Well, this is all very well, but in Nietzsche's work, there's also an attempt to transfigure or overcome the world, and this is his version of religion. Now, here it's no longer a monotheistic religion that's at issue. It's not about God. But there is a strongly religious impulse in his account of what he calls the eternal return, the idea of affirming the eternal recurrence. We've already touched on this in the discussion of amor fati. The idea for Nietzsche is that there's a kind of a thought experiment that we can do. This thought experiment of affirming life in all its horror. And that is supposed to transfigure our relationship to the world around us, and perhaps it will have some effect on the world and on people around us. So that is what Nietzsche proposes positively in his philosophy. That's something which he thinks is a counter movement to all the false ideologies that keep us from confronting the meaninglessness of existence.
Now, I want to sort of slightly change tack here. As well as the characters in Nietzsche and the Burbs, there is one other character which feeds into what you've been saying about sort of mediocrity and, all that sort of, those beautiful that's a beautiful prose that you sort of that you mentioned there, Lars, about Nietzsche and sand and all that. But the other kind of big character is the most mediocre character of all in this novel, and that's the suburbs themselves, and the suburban ennui that they precipitate. So I was wondering, could you maybe talk a little bit about that? As how, well, firstly, how do the suburbs figure in the book, and sort of what's, I suppose, the philosophical significance for you?
Yeah, the suburbs are comfortable, they're safe, you can feel at home in the suburbs. But this is a feeling at home of people who've given up on this larger task of loving or creating or longing, according to a Nietzschean diagnosis. So what, if we were to follow Nietzsche here, the suburbs are a way of settling down, of preventing ourselves from despising ourselves, or trying to overcome ourselves. The suburbs are a form of wretched contentment. So suburbs are the place where the last human beings live, where everyone wants the same, where everyone is the same. That's the problem with the suburbs. The suburbs present themselves as the invention of happiness. Now, the idea is that the suburbs embody happiness, the happy life. And that's what the characters struggle against. It's not that the suburbs aren't pleasant. It's not that they aren't safe and a great place to raise children. The point is, for the characters, the suburbs have pretended to invent the happy life. And it's that happy life that they reject.
Yeah, so, and I mean, that is the nihilism, isn't it? Suburban nihilism, in a sense. It's sort of, that's a wonderful phrase, a wretched contentment, sort of happy in your own demise. But the suburbs they do speak to that notion of nihilism as that which is leveling, that which is generating uniformity, that which is generating sameness, and boredom as well, which is another big character in your novel. That's like, these kids are bored.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. So the suburbs do not offer the characters a chance for growth and self-overcoming. It doesn't offer the characters the possibility of overcoming themselves, of distinction in some way. So this, for me, is what the suburbs are against. They're against life, understood in a general sense. They're against what it means to be human in a large sense. What's missing here is a kind of health, a kind of ascent, a developing towards greater modes of being. The suburbs are stagnant. They drive us into mediocrity, into the condition of sand grains.
The characters, these teenagers, they have that Nietzschean aristocratic disdain for people who live in the suburbs, and they sort of see themselves in some way as better. Now, I suppose it's one of the things that people don't like Nietzsche for either, that he does have this sort of sense of hierarchy, or, they try to conceive themselves as Nietzsche's übermensh. So maybe I was wondering, is that something that was in your mind when you were writing the novel or composing the novel, that sort of the übermensch is an alternative to this suburban sort of decay, or this suburban, well, maybe decay is too strong a word, because as you say, like, like people like us, probably most academics live in the suburbs, like, sort of middle-class people, middle-class anxieties. So in what sense are these students and these teenagers übermensch?
Well, the characters, some of them at least, want to strive towards this Nietzschean greatness, but other characters call it into question. Paula, for example, the character Paula.
Oh, great character, yeah.
Yeah, she's very suspicious of this attempt to become great. She's very suspicious of Nietzsche, the character, and indeed Nietzsche, the philosopher. What she thinks is that Nietzsche is just a wretch. He's a wretched guy who sits around and he's unhappy with life, and he conjures up these great metaphysical ideas as a way of trying to overcome his isolation. And that's what Paula thinks about the real Nietzsche and the Nietzsche in the novel. And what Paula argues, what she says throughout the novel, is that pity and compassion actually have some kind of importance. They're not things to be despised. That what human beings are not isolated grains of sand, but nor are they isolated attempts to become übermensch. The point is for Paula is that we can have meaningful relations with other people. Paula understands this primarily in the novel romantically, but it's also there in the friendship the characters enjoy. And I wanted the novel to put this point really quite forcefully, that the Nietzschean intolerance of pity, of compassion, the Nietzschean emphasis on the solitary übermensch, it passes over the lived reality of friendship, of forms of community, and the possibility of social and political change. And Paula embodies that, and so in a more humorous way does my character Merv, who, this is part of the fun of the novel. It's part of its cartoonish element. Merv becomes a convert to Dostoevsky, and he espouses Father Zosima-like views.
Idiot, yeah.
Yeah, and he reads The Idiot, and they all thought he was the idiot of the group, but actually he turns out to be the sage of the group. So yeah, with Merv, with Paula, and elsewhere in the novel, I'm trying to call into question this aristocratism, this inegalitarian part of Nietzsche's work.
Yeah, can I ask, maybe I'm reading too much into it here, why is that character called Paula? Is it a reference to St. Paul?
No, well,
I'm reading too much into it, Lars.
She was supposed to be Paul Ray. She
of course, Ray. Right.
Yeah. But then, she took over. She had her own character.
It's like Cartman, yeah.
And maybe it is linked to Paul in some way. There's references to St. Paul throughout the novel. Art is what he began as Arthur Schopenhauer. So the idea was, and Lou, of course, began
Lou
as
Salome, yeah.
Yeah, that's right, as Lou Salome. So these were based on these historical personages, but actually they moved away from their original positions. They began drifting about as I carried on writing the novels.
Yeah. So Paula kind of becomes a bit of a sort of a hero in it, and I don't believe in ruining spoilers, so I'm going to do it anyway. She basically cops off with Nietzsche's girlfriend, but I suppose what her critique is in the novel is that, and this is probably germane to the idea of the suburbs, is that what they're adopting is a pose. They're looking for poses. They're looking for some kind of a version of themselves. That's not what they actually are.
Yeah, they're understanding themselves in world historical form. And what Paula suggests is, and it's a point which is made, and it's kind of funny, but it's also serious. Paula suggests we look to disco as a more positive phenomenon. Now, this is the disco of the loft in New York back in the 70s. It's a disco of, I've forgotten the name of that guy, which is really annoying. The Love Will Save the Guy DJ, who led a very, very moving life. So the guy they're thinking about when it comes to disco is, what's his name? David Mancuso, that's right. And David Mancuso was an orphan who moved to New York, and after various adventures, set up this disco in a place which he called the Loft. Right. It was actually his space. He owned it. It was part of a warehouse. And it's very, very moving when you read biographies of David Mancuso. Because what David Mancuso did, he blew up these balloons and let them float at chest height. He would squeeze fresh orange juice for his guests. He'd bake organic bread for them. He wouldn't charge people very much. He always let in people who'd be excluded elsewhere. He played the records without interruption. He didn't have an ego as a DJ. He wanted to create a space where everyone felt welcome. And what's amazing is that David Mancuso was trying to recreate moments of joy that he felt when he was in his orphanage. One of the nuns who ran the orphanage used to stage these parties in which he'd let the children pick records to play and blow up balloons and float about, and generally get everyone to have fun. And that is what Merv talks about. And Merv talks about the disco, and Paula thinks about the disco too, because the disco is a place where you let in, black people, Hispanic people, gay people, transsexual people. You welcome into the disco all kinds of people as a kind of community. And this disco form of the ethical, if I can call it that, is embodied in a second band in Nietzsche and the Burbs, and the second band is called Dancing Star. And I love that name, Dancing Star. It amused me when I thought of that, because it reminded me, of the famous quotation in Nietzsche: "You must have chaos in yourself to give birth to a dancing star." And this is the dancing star that embraces the chaos of queer, multiracial life in New York. This is the wonderful chaos of the Loft. So I counterpose the Loft and the band Dancing Star to Nietzsche and the Burbs. Nietzsche and the Burbs is serious, it's rockist, it sees itself world historically. Disco's much more frivolous and fun, and yet it has a positive sense of community as implicit to it.
Right. Yeah. So it's kind of a community of difference, I guess, of some kind that disco poses. Yeah, I did. Sorry, I didn't pick up. I'm glad you told me about that because I didn't pick up on that that disco reference in the novel. So then I think so. Disco is kind of an antidote to I suppose the fact that a lot of these characters, like Nietzsche himself, and the other characters, might take themselves a little bit too seriously, right? And I like that because one of the questions I wanted to ask you is like that these are nihilists, right? Or they're going through nihilism, they're trying to respond to nihilism and trying to overcome the despair and mental health problems attendant to nihilism. And you do reference this in the book. I mean, why don't they? The question I wanted to ask is, why don't they become terrorists? Why don't they go down that road? Why disco rather than ISIS? Is that the question the novel is asking?
Yeah, but the character Chandra does propose terrorism.
That's right.
And revolutionary sabotage is also proposed by the character Art. So terrorism is a temptation for them. And, in some sense, the characters are led to this kind of world-denying will to nothingness of terrorism as a consequence of some of the ways of their patterns of thinking. So I wanted Chandra in particular to embody this, the temptation of death, of nothingness, the attempt to simply destroy the world, destroy yourself. And the way I dramatize this is by talking about a character called, now what was her name? I've forgotten. Annie Tasker, that's right. And Annie Tasker has killed herself before the novel began. Annie Tasker is a fellow pupil of the sixth formers, and she killed herself. And many of the characters they discuss the significance of Annie Tasker's suicide. Now, for Chandra, suicide is admirable. It's a way of simply negating a world that you cannot stand. It's a form of personal apocalypse. But for Paula, by contrast, you destroy the very possibility of a world, the very possibility of life through this kind of suicide. So that's how I dramatize this in the novel. This idea of taking oneself a bit too seriously, perhaps, or rather of being drawn to various forms of death, of dissatisfaction, of destroying the world. But it's a serious point. The notion of the apocalypse, the experience of the apocalypse, as we find it in history, is often linked to these antinomian movements, these movements to try and overturn the world as it currently exists. Now, opposed to those attempts to simply overturn everything about the world are those attempts to reform the world within the parameters of current life. And that is what Paula attempts to do. It's what Merv perhaps points to. I think Paula in particular points to this in this idea of a community of love, a community where love is the law. And that's the reference to Paul there, I think, in Paula's name.
A lot of those are previous forms, I guess, Lars. So you could like disco, and then there's basically, I think a sort of 1990s dance culture is also sort of referenced as another type of alternative community, or another sort of pursuit of meaning that has emerged as a countervailing force to the sort of pervasive suburban nihilism. Do you envisage any sort of future for these characters? The novels, it concludes around the time of they do their exams and stuff like that, and kind of the future is open. Do you think that, how shall I put this? Do you discern any future versions of those alternative lifestyles, if you follow me?
Well, the novel, we've got real spoilers here, so apologies to readers.
Oh, spoilers are great. Spoilers make you work harder. Yeah, I don't believe in that. It's my own bugbear. Yeah.
The novel comes to a close with an affirmation of hope, and all the characters get together. All the characters are going to live with one another. All the characters are going to inhabit Art's house. Art is one of the characters who's been abandoned by his parents. They've gone off to live in America, and the parents are going to demolish the house and bring Art over to America to live with them. And Art says he's not going to go to America. He's not going to go to Boston. He's going to stay where he is in Wokingham, and he's going to resist the demolition of his house. And he's going to do this with his friends. His friends are all going to move in with him. Now, this is a subplot in the novel. It's something which you get, it comes up at various points. But at the end of the novel, the guys who were interested in the band have turned away from the band, and now they're thinking of forms of communal life. And they've been able to persuade Paula and Merv and the other characters, Noel and Tana, they persuade them all to come together in this commune. And that is the model of hope for them. Now, of course, in that commune, what I was thinking of was the Invisible Committee. So the Invisible Committee, and struggling with their thoughts, struggling with their ideas, lies behind a lot of this novel, and indeed the next novel I'm writing at the moment. For the Invisible Committee, you can separate yourself off into a commune. Politics as it currently stands, nothing's really going to happen. Nothing's really going to change.
Sorry, the Invisible Committee, Lars, could you just explain that?
This group of anarchists who live in the French countryside, and they're a collective, and they've written as a collective 3 books. The first one's called The Coming Community. It came out about 15 years ago. The second one, my favourite one, is called To Our Friends. And the third one came out recently. I've forgotten what it's called, but it's also a really fine provocation. And what you find in the Invisible Committee is an attempt to live in the world in a kind of exodus, to live outside of conventional institutions, conventional structures. And what they've done, and this is something this is what they embody in their lives. What they've done is to form a community, form a commune in the French countryside, and that's where they live. And they seem to occasionally carry out acts of sabotage, but they also write these wonderful books, which are so provocative and so thought-provoking. I'm always tempted to go and form a radical commune, and I'm not sure about revolutionary sabotage, but I'm always tempted to leave behind the world, leave society, just go.
Go to the mountains, make revolution, yeah?
Go somewhere, we'll just try and live in a way which is where we have some sort of integrity, where you're not constantly doing things you despise, doing things which are totally ethically dubious.
Doing a bullshit job, like sort of, what's his name says, David Graeber, is it?
David Graeber says, yeah, sure. So this is the point. I think Biffo puts this really well. Now, what's he say?
So Francesco Berardi, is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. Franco Biffo,
Italian philosopher, yeah.
That's right. Now, Biffo says somewhere, we have to simply refuse the world. We just simply have to refuse the world as it currently stands, a word very common to all these Italian philosophers. We have to live in some kind of exodus. So just get out of the world, live in exodus, refuse the consolations of the world, just get out. And that's where the characters end up at the end of the novel. They end up with a decision to form a commune.
Yeah, I mean, I think you might be right on that, Lars. I think that could be the future. I mean, we've seen iterations of this in the past. Like, I mean, the hippie culture in the 60s was a type of commune. Woodstock, I guess, being the sort of the prime example of that. But in the future, I think there could be too, with the sort of fragmentations that we're going to be experiencing with the climate collapse, with sort of political disintegration. I could envisage people turning to communes. Communes are the family. Maybe communes are sort of your left-wing version of it. The family is your right-wing version of it. Although obviously that's a sort of a silly binary.
Well, yeah. The problem is, though, a left critique of the commune is that we need larger institutions if we're going to affect change. How are we going to address climate change technologically through geoengineering unless we have institutions? How are we going to even feed the amount of people who are in the world at the moment without institutional help? What about something like the NHS? If the NHS is to exist, we need to have some kind of collective institution that we all pay for our taxes. So that might be the left critique of communalism, of the idea of the commune. But this is not a critique which would impress the Invisible Committee themselves.
Why is that?
Because they want to reject institutions as such. What they want to do is to live in what Agamben calls in the last volume of his Homo Sacer series. They want to live in destitution. To destitute is to undo forms of institution, to move outside of them and our dependency on them. And here I think the Invisible Committee are very influenced by a philosopher who's not really very much read, and that's Ivan Illich. So Ivan Illich's work, very famous in the 70s.
It's a Christian sort of pedagogic thinker,
And Ivan Illich wrote a series of books, each of which was concerned with a particular institution and how he might leave that institution.
Yeah, so most famously, sorry to cut across you, Lars, most famously Ivan Illich wrote Deschooling Society.
That's it, yeah, exactly. Yeah. And he not only wrote these books, but he also founded movements, social movements, which really has some efficacy in the context in which he was working. So Ivan Illich, I think he's very important influence on Agamben, I think he's a very important influence on the Invisible Committee, and he's someone who I read and try to follow, try to understand, try to think through in my own small way. But that Ivan Illich's work is a big influence on what I've been trying to do in this novel and indeed the next novel.
Yeah, so I mean that's one of the things, the sort of the suburban nihilism that you're talking about. There is, I think, in the novel a critique of institutions, and I mean that feeds into what you're saying about Illich, deschooling society, kind of a sort of there's a kind of anarchistic dimension to what these characters are representing, and sort of in the novel there's a sort of a critique of there's a critique of schools, there's a critique of universities, science teachers. I think business courses in particular come in for particular ire.
Well, the next novel is polemic against business studies.
Is it?
Yeah, the whole novel is just written against business studies at school and at university. But yeah, you're right. So there are anti-institutional moments in the novel, and much of it is anarchistic. The students, I deliberately want to present the school pupils, as caught between a kind of aristocratic envy. They want to have been fee-paying school children. They want to have been to one of the big private schools. They want to have gone to Oxford. That they have this about them, but at the same time they're also drawn to ideas of the common, to ideas of living in community, living in communes. So there's that tension in the work. It's very deliberate. I was very careful about this. On the one hand, they're drawn towards inegalitarian Nietzschean solutions to the problem of nihilism. On the other, they're drawn to left anarchist communalism. So that's the tension in the work, and we know how it resolves at the end.
Yeah, I mean, it's the conclusion is. I mean, you leave the last words with Paula in the novel, don't you? Well, it's kind of Beckettian. The end of the novel. It's sort of. Sorry, what was that famous quote from Beckett? Fail better. Is that right?
That's right. But fail better is actually the name of the consultancy formed by Nietzsche's sister in the novel as well.
Oh, she's not very nice, is she? Her.
Well, she's my embodiment of what the predecessors to the Invisible Committee, who were called the Ticken Collective. Ticken Collective wrote this wonderful book called Theory of the Young Girl. And she's my embodiment of the young girl, of the thrusting business type, the entrepreneur, the person who has a very clear sense of what happiness is and how one should live. That's Nietzsche's sister in the novel. And that's what she proposes when she comes to talk to the sixth form and to the pupils in the sixth form. She's asking them to come and join the new corporate reality, to give up their youth, to come along and oppose and struggle with corporate reality, but as part of that corporate reality.
To work for the man, basically, to sell out.
Yeah, but what the twist in the novel is that, and I drew this from the work of Peter Fleming. Peter Fleming is a contemporary business studies person who is against, the normal things you'd find in business studies. And Peter Fleming has written several case studies of the way in which firms try to incorporate counterculture, the way in which firms try to incorporate dissent.
Right. So, for example, you might have, I don't know, a major firm like, having a float at Pride or something like that.
That's right. And even more than that, in the interview process, they'll often say, tell me what you hate about our firm. And it could be consumerism. It could be an emphasis on profit. So these firms actually want to hear from their employees about what they hate about the firm. And the firms in response offer SOPs. For example, people working for the firm can go and do some charity work for a morning per week, or they're allowed to do they're allowed for a 2-week sabbatical to go off to an African country to build huts there, this sort of thing. So that is one of the things I wanted to embody in that character, Nietzsche's sister. You're absolutely right to say the novel ends with this, with Paula. And Paula says at the end of the novel, we'll just fail, but that's okay. And what I was thinking there, I was thinking about the collective group that the literary theorist and novelist Maurice Blanchot formed in the early 60s, and it was called the International Review. And this was a group which was going to try and diagnose the current situation in the world through a collective writing practice. And reflecting on the failure of that group, Blanchot writes, it failed, but it did so utopianly. And that's what I was thinking of when giving Paul that line. Things can fail, but they can be mini utopias. They can point towards something positive, something worthwhile.
Right. So then I think what sort of to draw things to a close, I guess. I mean, I mean, I think you've given a really good account of the novel, and you sort of made it even richer for me because I mean, well, when you read, you don't. Reading is a sort of an active task, isn't it? And I guess I guess Blanchot's behind this novel as well, Lars, isn't he? I mean, he's one of your. Well, I mean, you've written a lot of academic work on Blanchot, Maurice Blanchot, the French philosopher.
Yeah, absolutely. So thematically, my concerns are often the concerns you might find in Blanchot's work. So I'm always very interested in the relation to the other human being or other others as well. And that interest is something which guided my work in writing on Blanchot, trying to excavate out of Blanchot's work an ethics and a politics in some way, and trying to think his relationship with his close friend, the philosopher Emmanuel Levinas, try and think through that relationship between Blanchot and Levinas in such a way that we might produce I don't know, a sort of social philosophy or a political philosophy, something like that. That was always my concern when I worked in academic philosophy, and I wrote these books on these topics and papers. Not very good books, not very good papers, but I was trying nevertheless.
Oh, they were magisterial, Lars. They were magisterial.
Oh, magisterial. But that project carries over into the novels, in particular into the first 3 novels I wrote, the Spurious Trilogy. They are drawn straight out of all the themes. They are drawn straight out of my attempt to think that relationship between Blanchot and Levinas.
Yeah, so I'm wondering why those figures. So, like the Spurious Trilogy was sort of your Blanchot books, I guess. Your last book was on Wittgenstein, and this book is on Nietzsche. I'm not sure what the next one will be on.
Simone Weil.
Simone Weil. Okay, right. Simone Weil in business school. Yeah. So, what is it about those 3 figures? Is there something that? Do they have a common denominator? Is there something that you think is important about those type of, I guess, they're kind of anti-philosophers in a way?
They are, that's right. The first 3 novels are about the characters W and Lars looking for a leader. The next 3 novels, which I call the Philosophers Trilogy, is about leaders appearing in the midst of groups of individuals. So the leaders have appeared. What are they like? The leaders embody philosophy in some sense. They live philosophy in their lives. They're doing what Pierre Hadot, the great French philosopher of ancient thought, what he called a spiritual life. They're attempting to embody philosophy in the way in which they live, in everything they do, in the way they speak, in every gesture. And that's what we find in Wittgenstein. That's what we find in Nietzsche. That's what we find in Simone Weil. It's a revival of a more ancient sense that philosophy is about the way in which you live, and that you as a philosopher have to live in a very particular and exemplary way. And that is something which inspires the people around them. And what's interesting here is the people around these individuals often don't understand the actual philosophy that these individuals are espousing. Now, if you look at people around Wittgenstein, that was what people...
You hang out with academics, yeah?
Yeah, well, so around Wittgenstein, there are a whole bunch of people who said, look, we had no idea in Wittgenstein's seminars what he was talking about. But what was compelling about him was his seriousness. What was compelling was the way in which he put ideas together. And that's what these 3 thinkers embody for me, for the characters around them. The characters around Wittgenstein, my version of Wittgenstein, my version of Nietzsche, and in the next novel, my version of Simone Weil, the characters around them don't really understand fully the philosophies. They have a rough sense of what's going on, but no more than that. And they bumble about in their own way. But, the idea then for me is, what do you do when you're confronted with someone who tries to live philosophy? What effect does it have on you? So that's what these 3 novels, these philosophers' novels, are about.
Yeah, and that's where the comedy emerges from. Yeah. I mean, Blanchot is an interesting one for me because he's one of the few philosophers who started off sort of right wing. I think he was quite sort of taken with sort of fascistic ideas, but he kind of became more left wing as he sort of got older. And he's kind of all of those figures, right, have a kind of a redemptive quality in them. They're all kind of sort of secular saints.
They are.
That's not sort of a clumsy term, sort of secular saints, but is that something that you're trying to articulate in your novels? I mean, we haven't really talked about the religious dimension of this. Is that something you're trying to articulate, or is that something you're trying to get to?
Yeah, certainly.
The meaningless world.
Yeah. So how so someone like Simone Weil embodies this spiritual life in such an overwhelming way. You read a biography; it is at one with her thought. And likewise, people like Blanchot. I think Edith Wischergrod, didn't she write a novel about postmodern saints? Wasn't that what it was called? In that novel, I think she discusses Blanchot and Blanchot's thought. She probably didn't know much about his life. A lot more about his life has emerged now. So this idea of sainthood is something I'm explicitly exploring in Simone Weil, sainthood and the impossibility of sainthood. That's also very important to me, because these kinds of figures, when they reappear in contemporary Britain, they're so far from anything you encounter in ordinary life that they're also ridiculous figures. They're laughable figures. They're idiots. They're holy fools, as well as being, full of gravity and seriousness. So when I recreate these characters, when I reincarnate them in contemporary life, I make them idiotic in some sense. I make them close to a kind of foolishness. And I make them kind of more depressed than their real counterparts were, more out of place, more sad. There's a sadness about Nietzsche in this novel in particular. So when he talks about affirmation, when he talks about how we should aspire to become great, there's also something pathetic about the way in which he says that. At least that's what I was trying to convey as I wrote. So yes, sainthood, but also the impossibility of sainthood, the impossibility of what these figures might embody in our world, because they're just so remote from postmodern life, where these big names are no longer famous, no longer well known. They've been dissolved. Where the great names of modernity, these great philosophers, they don't really have much
purchase.
Purchase on this world around us.
So the the historical Nietzsche, he ended up in a sort of you mentioned in a novel that, and I didn't actually know this, but Elizabeth Nietzsche, historical Nietzsche's fascist sister, she basically kind of turned Nietzsche, after he had his mental collapse, into a kind of a almost like a theme park ride. Like she charged people to go and have a look at him. Is that correct? Yeah,
pretty much.
Well, she's a charmer.
Well, and she's very similar to Nietzsche's sister. So Nietzsche's sister in the novel, she claims to be very proud of Nietzsche, of the Nietzsche in the novel, and she thinks he's fantastic. He's very booky and clever. But you can imagine her trying to turn his life into something that can be monetized. She already calls her consultancy Fail Better Consultancy. So she succeeded in monetizing this famous quotation from Beckett. And you can imagine her constructing a motivational book out of things that the historical Nietzsche or my Nietzsche might have said.
She's the last man, basically, I think.
She's the last man. She's the young girl of the Tickon book. She's supposed to be the very incarnation of this. A figure who, in trying to put her together, it was extremely important for me to get her right. I read a lot of books on management theory, on business studies, to try and get a sense of the reality of contemporary corporate life.
Right. So, and Nietzsche in the book, your Nietzsche, he also has a mental collapse, at the end, and he ends up tragically in an institution. Is that right?
That's right. So he ends up in an institution. He's already had one mental collapse in his life. This is his second one. What will happen as a result? Well, who quite knows? But he'll be released into the company of his mother and his sister. His sister's a horror, but his mother is also a horror. And again, I was thinking of the historical Nietzsche, who's released into the care of his mother and his sister. And Nietzsche's mother in my novel is a heavy drinker. She's someone who seems to have an incestuous love of her son. She despised Nietzsche's father, and so Nietzsche's being released when he comes out of the institution. He's released back into these people's care, so things are not going to go well for him, I think.
Okay, so just to draw things to a close, then, should we now read Nietzsche? Should we be reading Nietzsche? Is Nietzsche sort of a therapy for all the ailments of the age?
Well, he's certainly not quite a therapy in that way. Look, I mean, Nietzsche's very familiar to us as this existentialist, the death of God, nihilism, and so on and so forth. But I think it's very important to remember the other side of Nietzsche, the very disturbing anti-egalitarian Nietzsche. And that's a figure to wrestle with and to think about. Malcolm Bull wrote an interesting book a few years ago for Verso called Anti-Nietzsche, which suggests we might read Nietzsche not as people who think that we are the übermensch, that we are the great people, that the free spirits Nietzsche's writing for, but to read from what's he called it? To read as losers. To read Nietzsche as a loser in some sense. And that is a way, I think, of thinking about what Nietzsche might mean to us. To read Nietzsche, but to think of oneself as less than an übermensch, as very much less than a free spirit.
Okay. So I think we'll thank you very much, Lars. We'll draw to a close there.
Thanks very much, Patrick.